You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Zach Bechtold and Matt Franks. If you'd like to learn more about the Bearded Theologians, you can go online at beardedtheologians.com, where we have past podcasts, blogs, and a couple items for sale. So check us out, beardedtheologians.com. Thank you for listening, and enjoy this week's show. You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Matt Franks
and Zach Bechtold.
So this week on the podcast, we're opening up our fancy-dancy lectionary readings for this week, and we found that Colossians 3, 1 through 11 seems to be a fun text to look at and to talk about. And so, Zach, as you do what you do with that text, do your thing.
Do what I do. I read it. It, Metrics.
Sometimes you don't. So I just leave it. I'm trying to be like letting you let the Spirit move you. Either say you all can read it or however you want to do it.
Thank you. I appreciate the space, my friend. We're going to talk about Colossians 3, 1 through 11. And I'm going to read it, but I'm going to preface it first. Saying that here in chapter 3, there's a lot. There's a lot we're not going to get into, especially as you get down into verses 18 and 22, where it talks about...
I just said stop at 11.
I know, but I want to give context to the whole thing and why we're not reading that.
Because the lectionary says so. That's why.
Oh, my gosh. Oh, you're listening to the Bearded Theologians comedy podcast. There are some difficult things to deal with here, especially in our context today. I'm talking about wives submitting to husbands, slaves obeying their masters. We're not going to talk about those things today, not because we want to avoid the conversation, but because the lectionary only takes us through 11. Matt and I highly encourage you to dig into the fullness of this in its context and why they're talking about these things. But we digress. Colossians chapter 3, 1 through 11. Therefore, if you are raised with Christ, look for the things that are above, where Christ is sitting at God's right hand. Think about the things above and not things on earth. You died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. So put to death the parts of your life that belong to earth, such as sexual immorality, moral corruption, lust, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. The wrath of God is coming upon disobedient people because of these things. You used to live this way when you were alive to these things, but now set aside these things, such as anger, rage, malice, slander, obscene language. Don't lie to each other. Take off the old human nature with its practices and put on the new nature, which is renewed in knowledge by conforming to the image of the one who created it. In this image, there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all things in all people. So Matt, that's a lot to take in. But I'll ask you the $1 million question. What piqued your interest? What piqued your interest? What caught your attention?
I mean, obviously, if I were preaching this week, talking about the unity that Christ brings is important. I think with all this going on in the world, in our lives, of how we become so divided on just simple issues, like even just like color of carpet or color, I remember like a couple years ago that the color of the dress, what was the color of the dress? Those things, like the real question is how does this affect, our walk with God? And I think that those are things to wrestle with. But I love the line that there at the end that you read, Christ is all things and in all people. To me, that's very important as someone who tries to get us to remember those things, that Christ is in us, whether we recognize that or not. And how do we go about living our life with Christ? I think that that's important. This whole idea, I really think what Paul's getting at here is hey, like, be like Jesus, like, just be like Jesus. Don't do these things. And I, this is definitely one of the clobber verses that sometimes gets used for anti-LGBTQIA people. The idea of sexual immorality here is really more geared towards the practice of sex and how it was being used and abused, more so than what most people read into this. This is one of those texts that people read into very, very easily. And that's even the latter parts too, that we're not going to get to today. We probably may get to next week, depending on how we feel. But I think that that's something that needs to be said, is that, like, this is more towards the practice of that than it is the practice of those things. So Zach, as you think about that, what comes to mind?
Yeah. I've used this in a sermon series a couple of times, and I think I've always titled it "New Robes," simply for the taking these old things off and putting on Christ. Kind of like you said, this is very die to the old self type writing from Paul. Here's what you used to be. Here's where you're going. As you lean into who and what and where Christ leads you. And so those are, I'm with you. This is very much a heavy-handed, or can be a heavy-handed verse or set of scripture, as Paul does with the litany of things of stop doing this. I think what changes that for me, or not changes it, but brings into context, if you're not reading it, at least in the CEB, the Common English Bible, there's a parenthetical here after the litany of stop doing these things: sexual immorality, moral corruption, lust, evil desire, and greed. There's a parenthetical in mine that just says, which is idolatry. And for me, that's the litany of these things. When you abuse people in such a way that's idolatry, right? That you're using them for your pleasure, or your gain, or your whatever. It corrupts the relationship. It pulls you apart from the people in which you're in relationship with, good or bad. And Paul's saying stop. For me, Paul's saying stop abusing people, stop using people, and move away from that, move towards Christ. Put down your anger, put down your rage, put down your slander, put down these things that tear you away from others. And Matt and I talk a lot about on this podcast of kind of the full circle. When you're loving God, or at least, I don't know, it's a central theme of my theology. When you're loving God, you're loving people. When you're loving people, you're loving God. And anything that you do that tears you, that breaks relationship with either God or people, you're moving further away rather than closer. And for me, that's a lot of what this passage is. It's how do we move closer in relationship with people, take off the old nature and its practices in verse 9 there, and put on the new. Put on who God created you to be. Put on, reading into it, the fruits of the spirits, right? Putting on Christ and all the love and grace that is there, rather than what pulls you away from people, pulls you away from God. I think there's a lot here to unpack, especially in the context of, like you said, misusing verses, misusing scripture, using it to beat people down, using it to, especially when you get into the back end of this about wives and slaves and things like that, using it to justify horrific actions, right? And mistreating people. There's a lot to this. And, so much of, if you've listened to this podcast for any amount of time, anytime we talk about Paul, I'm not a fan, but this is somewhere where I really like what Paul has to say, and taking off the old life, putting that away, leaving it behind, and putting on who and what Christ is. Really speaks to me.
Well, and when you say that, that's like the crux of what we're trying to do.
Absolutely.
For all of us in our, that we're definitely not, we're working towards perfection. And so it's a constant renewal of looking at ourselves and what we're doing and, all that jazz. And I think that that's the thing that a lot of people struggle with, is that like they expect this thing to just be one and done when it's a lifelong process of growth, more so than anything. And, you look at this verse and you can wrestle with like, well, I don't do this and I don't do this, but I do this. Oh man, like I'm not a good person. Well, no, that's not how this works. I think that when we wrestle with that, like, and I really think that Paul's calling us to wrestle with what it is, like what's keeping us away from putting on the new. And I think that that's that's something to, as we wrestle with that, ask ourselves that, it's something I ask almost weekly, what are you doing? I call it your butts. What butts are in the way from keeping you from really following Jesus? Because you can look throughout all of Scripture, you can see what butts get in the way of people trying to do something that God's calling them to do. And they say, well, but I can't do this, but,
right.
And God always definitely provides a way. Even Jesus wrestled with that, when he was sitting in the Garden of Gethsemane. Lord, I don't want to do this, but I know that you need me to.
Yeah.
So
this is what's to be. Yeah. Well, and you definitely see that here in the litany. There's 3 litanies here, 3 list of things Paul lists. Here are things that break you away that are your butts for people, right? How I treat them, set these things aside, but I'm angry, right? Set these things aside, but I want to talk about that person, and then gets down into things people can't help, right? Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian or Slytherin, right? If you're a Harry Potter fan, slave or free, you're right? Things that it is. Paul, here are all the things for Paul that are dividing people for this area, for the Colossians. And he's essentially saying, get over it. Look beyond these things. Set yourself aside. Set all of the preconceived notions you've had aside. Set aside how you've been treating people and put that down and pick up the love and grace of Christ and see how that changes your relationship. See how that changes how you view the world around you and treat the people around you. He definitely starts with self, which is always funny because arguably Paul gets a bad rap. And I like to give him that one from time to time. But like I said, this is one of the places where I think he gets it. He gets it well in saying, put all of these things aside that divide you, that remove you away from relationship with people, and move towards Christ and see how it brings you together.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a good place to land for us today, as you consider those things. If you want to talk about that, feel free to reach out to us through the social medias and all that good stuff. We've got some really good content. And one of the things that helps us is, please feel free to share us with your circles and what we do. That's always helps get what we do out there and a little bit more. And that can always help. And you can find out more about us at beardedtheologians.com. And so for the Bearded Theologians, I'm Matt Franks.
I'm Zach Bechtold. Thanks for checking us out.
I want you to subscribe and like this video and push that thumbs up.
Thank you for listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share on all social media outlets. You can check out old episodes and more information at beardedtheologians.com. Thanks for checking us out.